Hello. Okay. I'm just gonna record this bit of myself. I'm not recording the screen. I'm just recording my face. Because some people couldn't make it and they wanted to hear sort of the introductory remarks. And those are what I was just gonna do right now. So a few remarks about the group, a few remarks about affect. But I'm really excited, first of all, to just see everyone. It's so great to see all these old friends and people from tons of different areas of my life and life history, and also just people from so many different backgrounds with so many different interests. And it seems like we're going to have a really great set of skills to like slice through the topic of affect and emotion. Yeah, I think that'll be really great, and I hope it's really productive for everyone. So yeah, just want to first acknowledge that right now I'm currently sort of playing this role of like convener or steward of this, and it's not something I'm super attached to, but I think someone should do it. And so if anyone else wants to do it, please, approach me and let me know, and I would be super happy to hand it off. But I think someone should play it, and so for now I'll just do that. Um, uh, let's see. I also want to say a bit about the sort of organization of the reading group thus far. So I put together, and I think I sent it to each of you, or I think I sent it to everyone, a copy of a sort of tentative syllabus or schedule. And this is really just like a first pass or rough draft at setting up themes, topics, and readings. And I would imagine we'll probably deviate a bit, maybe not in themes and topics, but certainly in readings when we already have. That is, we read some different things today than it initially said in the syllabus. And that'll probably continue for a variety of reasons. One is that I think our interests may morph as we learn more. I know mine certainly will. And also there will just be the pragmatics of making sure that everyone has access to the text and whatnot. And then there's also the layer of like current events. So that may also shift things. We have this giant election in the US coming up that may shift the way that we're thinking about or relating to like the sort of political or cultural world. So yeah, I think we should just be flexible there. So I think what I'll do is I'll set up a Google Doc version of that. And then I'll just link it into the event pages each time. I should also say that if Facebook doesn't work for people, I feel open to like setting up the events on one other platform in addition to it. So if Google or Eventbrite or something else works better for people, just let me know. You can just get at me with a direct message. So as far as timing goes, I'm inclined to hold this series of time slots, and I'm hoping that it fits in with your schedules. The reason I think we should hold it is, first of all, a selfish reason, which is that it slots nicely in with my teaching schedule. Also, the cadence of once every 2 weeks, I hope works for people. I hope it gives people enough time to like actually read the stuff if you're inclined to do so. And again, yeah, it works with my teaching schedule and also a series of other people in Cambridge who wanted to come to this event. So as for readings, I feel really committed to this group being really useful for anyone who shows up. And ideally, a sizable chunk of us will have already read many of the readings for each session. I don't mean prior to them being assigned. I just mean hopefully people will show up having done the readings. But I want to really be sensitive about the fact that lots of people have different backgrounds and different sort of educational backgrounds. So and also time amounts of time that they can dedicate to this. And so that being said, I know that it's not always going to be super easy or plausible for people to do all the readings, especially if there's like 2 or 3 academic texts on there, which we know take a long time. So to try to mitigate that a bit, I have included or intend to include every week at least one relatively effortlessly consumable text that's a non-academic text or video, so maybe an article or an editorial or a video that should take 15, 20, 30 minutes to consume. And these should hopefully be a sort of basic means of establishing some shared understanding, even if you can't do the other readings. So this will be in addition to the academic texts or articles, which do demand a lot more time and sometimes money. And I'm going to try to weave a pathway through the materials. Hopefully, we can do it in a way that doesn't cost a lot of money or inconvenience for people. But anyway, I just wanted to say all that. But like many other things in life, I think you get what you put into it. So I think it's a very good investment if you're really interested in these topics to read the academic texts, if you can, and to struggle through them. And that leads to another thing I want to say, which is a generic thing to say about reading not just affect theory, but theory in general, what we call theory in the humanities and social sciences. And this is also just a bit of reassurance. I don't think any of us are experts in this area. And also reading affect theory, like any other kind of theory reading, is super challenging. And I'm not just somebody who's reading these like a novel. Like, it's not easy for me, and I've been reading this stuff for like 15 years. I often will struggle with a single sentence, reading it 4 or 5 times. It takes me hours to read one of these articles, to be honest. And that's all just to say that if you find these texts difficult or downright impenetrable, you're not alone in that. And you're not stupid. You aren't doing it wrong. Like other forms of capital T theory, affect theory is highly referential as well. And so it refers to tons of outside texts and preformed ideas and discourses. And so sometimes we need to sort of go read a few Wikipedia articles or watch some YouTube videos or even read other theory in order to glean the meaning from the text that we started with. And I'll say that I still read theory in a way where much of the significance flies over my head. And sometimes I just have to let that go. So I think, unlike reading a novel where you understand every sentence, sometimes you just might not know what a paragraph is getting at, what a sentence is getting at. And you might just decide, you know what, I'm like going to skip over that one for now, and hopefully someone else picked it up. And that ultimately is why it's so valuable to read these as part of a group, because all these different people, all these different backgrounds, all these different contexts are able to read different sort of meanings into it, and then we can bring it all to the table and discuss it with each other, and hopefully through our collective experience and our collective insight, we can get at what these texts really mean and say. Okay, so I hope that's reassuring. It would also be really great maybe if each week we could have some specific people maybe commit to reading each of the things and maybe offering a brief synopsis in their understanding, and maybe we could discuss that at the end. So maybe we'll save like 5 minutes at the end for that. By the way, I've set aside an hour and a half for this. So, I hope that's okay. If people need it to be shorter, which I understand many of you are on the West Coast and this might be your lunch break and you might need it to be shorter, we can talk about that too. So just send me a direct message. But no judgment if you dip out early. Okay, so that's really the sort of prefatory thing I want to say about the group. So now maybe we can shift to affect theory. So I want to say a few things about affect theory, its significance, and why we might choose to read it in present times. And let me just say, I'm not intending to do this every week. It's just a way to get us started and on the same page with the sort of basics of affect theory. But don't expect me to sort of like lecture to folks all the time. It's definitely not my role. I'm here to learn with y'all, but given I have a little bit of background on this, I just wanted to offer these like basic thoughts. So affect theory, in my estimation, is fundamentally about the politics of feelings. Affect is inherently political since it analyzes the capacity to affect and be affected, that is, as a material body in the world. It is not an analysis of personal feelings so much as transpersonal feeling. That is, feelings shared by and transferred between people. So this is what people like Laurent Berlant, I know, Andrea, you were mentioning cruel optimism earlier. This is what Laurent Berlant's sort of idea of national sentimentality is getting at. It's not personal emotion, it's transpersonal feeling. So it is also fundamentally part of the world of what we call theory. That is critical theory, which attempts to analyze, diagnose, and transcend the conditions of life under capitalism and within capitalist society. And that being said, a variety of other political commitments, so feminist, queer, anti-racist, and other strands, have become increasingly prominent within critical theory, and these are very much present within affect theory as well. So affect theory is not divorcing itself from that sort of political heritage. At the same time, affect theory is also a response to a series of perceived failures and blind spots in the earlier sort of structuralist and post-structuralist versions of critical theory. So one of its seminal essays, Eve Kosofsky's, Sedgwick's, and Adam Frank's Shame in the Cybernetic Fold, published in 1995, opens with something of a diagnosis of theory as it existed prior to that moment. Calling out sort of the psychoanalytic theory of Freud and Lacan, also the new historicism of Greenblatt and Foucault, and the structuralism of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and the post-structuralism of Derrida, and arguably Foucault as well there. So Sedgwick turned in her analysis to the work of a relatively, sort of against these sort of tendencies, to a relatively obscure American psychologist named Sylvan Tompkins, who wrote about these sort of 9 pre-discursive, as he called them, affects, not to be confused with emotions, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that were sort of pathways between the human internal experience and the external world. And I'll touch more on that in a minute as well. So despite their differences, their difference to these earlier sort of theoretical tendencies, all these previous tendencies, they were really concerned with meaning, and that is sort of discursive meaning, right? They were part of this sort of literary turn in theory that was obsessed with sort of semiotics, what language means, how culture and other sort of structures sort of contain and tend to almost determine the things that we tend to think, and the ways we tend to sort of frame our sort of understanding of the world. So in contrast to this, as I mentioned above, affect theory offers an analysis of feeling. So where earlier strains of theory ask, what does it mean? Affect theory asks, how does it feel? And here it is actually very much a descendant of one strain of post-structuralist theory. So if you can think of, you've got critical theory, and then you have post-structuralist theory as a type of critical theory. I would say affect theory is probably under the umbrella of post-structuralist theory, not very tidily so, but it is very much influenced by the thought of Gilles Deleuze and his collaborator Félix Guattari. So for Deleuze and Guattari, the central question for theoretical analysis is not what does it mean, but what does it do? And here, theory is inherently part of a material world, which it acts in and acts upon, and is also acted upon. So affect theory is part of this new materialism that was sort of invented and inspired by Deleuze and Guattari. And Deleuze and Guattari, and Deleuze in particular, were themselves working with concepts that they inherited from the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, whose influence is quite evident when one digs around in the affect theory literature, and you'll see his name pop up all over these texts. Anyway, I haven't put any Deleuze or Spinoza into the course syllabus, but if people do want to read about it or read any of it, maybe we could do that over like the holidays, the winter holidays. So maybe we could form a subgroup that does that. It's really tedious stuff. It's like today's stuff was dense, but it's right up there with like the Masumi text. It's very dense. But anyway, I'm not going to go on about them right now. So Spinoza and Deleuze and Guattari, their influence is really present in one of the other founding texts of the so-called affective turn, this moment in the mid-90s. And that's Brian Masumi's The Autonomy of Affect, also published in 1995. So Masumi's Autonomy and Affect and Sidgwick's essay on shame in the cybernetic fold, they're generally seen as these two very staple texts of this affective turn in the mid-90s that starts to sort of take over the academy. And so this affective turn, beginning in the mid-90s, refers to the way that concepts and questions about feelings were beginning to alter how theory and theoretical analysis approached its research and thought about human social relations, culture, society, and power. And as I mentioned, politics, which have always been a sort of fundamental part of our analysis of power, is a central preoccupation of affect theory. And so if we want to alter the world, if we want to make it fairer or more just or less alienating or more sustainable, etc., we need to understand how power works and how certain interests and processes deprive us of making the world sort of fit for human habitation, as Hannah Arendt puts it. And we can't do that if our grasp of the channels and methods used by power to control, manipulate, influence, dominate, and determine is flawed or incomplete. If our way of seeing those things is incomplete, we're not going to understand how they're working. And so what affect theory posits, as seen in these sort of early texts by Masumi and Sidgwick, is that the highly dominant conversations about meaning in the world of sort of theory were really ignoring the place of feelings in power and politics. And as Masumi says at the end of his essay, affect helps us to understand politics outside of ideology in a world where ideology, quote, no longer defines the functioning of power, end quote. So this, I hope, will have real relevance and resonances for those of us seeking to understand politics in our current moment. It's pretty obvious that deeply irrational currents of desire and fear and pride and resentment and disgust animate our political landscape and drive political decisions. So if anyone here is familiar with the critical theorist Jürgen Habermas, it's clear that the sort of rationality of communicative reason that he advocates is failing. In other words, the exchange of ideas through the medium of verbal and written exchange is not necessarily having the political impact that it's supposed to have. And so we are not becoming this unified or gaining this unified or shared understanding of the universe. And so here I think it's really worth looking at someone like Trump, obviously, who everyone talks about. But Trump cannot be explained by an analysis of ideology. The guy has no ideology. He is, like Masumi's portrait of Reagan in the piece assigned for today, a deeply incoherent and self-contradictory and truly idiotic person. But his confidence speaks to the very sort of diverse aspirations of his base. And that channel is an affective one. And it isn't, and I don't think it's a coincidence that his influence on the stock market is also a really positive one, because the stock market is this speculative thing, is sort of acting on confidence, right? Investor confidence. So affect can have these real material impacts on the world. It's not just this thing that exists on another layer. It's part of this sort of materialism that we all exist in. And so we're going to be reading, particularly in our next two sessions, a bunch about how affect and emotion play into the political. And let me just say, I think it'll be really, really interesting to do those readings around this time of the election. And let me also say that none of the texts moving forward will be quite as dense as what we read today. So just if they were struggling to get through, I hope that's a bit of reassurance. So in addition to describing the sort of affective influence in regimes of control, the concept of affect also gets at new forms of labor, what the neo-Marxists Michael Hart and Antonio Negri call affective labor, which is a really important concept in a world of sort of post-industrial service-based economies, such as ours, where work is often cognitive and or oriented toward care. And this may provide new routes for grasping and resisting sort of gendered and racialized dynamics in our society. And I'll say a bit more about resistance and how affect and resistance relate in a moment. Anyway, if affect is important, I should say, I don't read affect theory as being a total disposal of the earlier theories on ideologies or discourses or whatever. Really, they should be seen as additive rather than replacing those earlier theories. And I think we can still continue to use theorists like Foucault or Derrida or Marx or Gramsci or whomever, while also referencing people like Laurent Berlant and Sedgwick and Masumi and Sarah Ahmed and Sian Nagai. There's no contradiction there, but I think having that added affective layer is really useful. So indeed, these theorists all of these theorists lament the role played by affect, or some of these theorists do anyway. And perhaps seek to establish politics on a more logical or rational basis. I think that's really true of someone like Laurent Berlant, who is more critical of affect than trying to grasp at what its sort of progressive potential is. And we can talk about all this while we read these thinkers. But anyway, what actually is affect? I didn't really touch on that. It's important to distinguish between affect and emotions, a distinction that is maybe not always made by all the affect theorists, but which is important to some of them. I mentioned earlier that one of the influences on the development of affect theory was the psychologist Sylvan Tompkins, who Sidgwick cites extensively in her essay Shame and the Cybernetic Fold. So Tompkins thought that affect is pre-discursive, meaning that it is not culturally produced. In other words, there are these innate sort of pathways that human organisms have between themselves and the outside world. Whereas emotions are processed feeling, which attaches to meaning and therefore is influenced by culture, the argument goes, affects are raw biological response. And here, there may be a chance for biological science, and this goes out to all the science people here, biological science to find a place within the discourse of affect theory. If affects are innate, then there is room for science in analyzing human relationships, politics, and culture. And I know this may be a very obvious statement to those of you in sciences that those fields have something to say about these matters. But for those of us in the humanities and social sciences, this is a big, scary deal, and one that has not gone unchallenged. So the question here really revolves around whether affects are pre-discursive and outside the realm of culture. And I really hope we can debate and discuss this as we dig into the literature on affect. Not all affect theorists think this, but yeah, I hope it's an ongoing discussion we can have. I'll note here, too, that the two seminal authors on affect theory, Masumi and Sedgwick, sort of disagree somewhat on this, and we can talk about that later in the discussion. So it should be said here now how strange it might seem for a queer theorist like Sedgwick to be embracing biological science and psychology, particularly because of the way that queer theory pretty much inherently seeks to escape the determinism and hard definitions of the human in favor of contingent, fluid, flexible, and open-ended transformation and becoming. But this is where Sedgwick's embrace of Tompkins is super interesting. So for Tompkins, affective pathways are not the same things as determining drives. Against the sort of psychological behaviorists, Tompkins claims that affect's outputs are not fixed. What's more, affects seem to be able to sort of exist for themselves. As the psychologist states, it is enjoyable to enjoy. It is exciting to be excited. It is terrorizing to be terrorized and angering to be angered. Affect is self-validating with or without any further referent. Again, placing it outside of the sort of sphere automatically of being part of sort of discourse or culture. So this, to dip into Masumi's terminology, is the autonomy of affect. Here, affect as a kind of a shuttle between the mind and the body, and not really belonging to either, opens onto what he calls the event, and this is Deleuze and Guattari's term, the event, a sort of moment of possibility or rupture or difference. This opposes the closed structures of meaning which exist in a sort of self-regenerating loop inside of our heads that cannot explain change. And this starts to get at another reason why we might choose to learn about affect through affect theory. In addition to helping us to understand, critique, and defend against the imbalances of power, affect also offers an opening against these. And I think we really saw a lot of this mentioned in the affect theory reader, the sort of inventory of Schimmer's introduction to that book. So one of these openings, I think, is the contextualization of psychological contingency in a material world, which has the capacity to both control and to disrupt. So one of the important things about affect theory's approach, and I hope the architects, if there are any, or designers in attendance, I thought there might be some, would perk up at this, is that it recognizes in sort of the materialism of the actual environment, the ways in which sort of people are affected by their environment. And it actually means that you can engage in a sort of spatial politics to alter your own interior subjectivity, a really interesting way of sort of hacking your way out of power relations. So Masumi says that intensity is unassimilable, and we can unpack that a little bit more, but here, sort of in addition to science, I think affect will have sort of special import for those who are interested in spiritual matters. For Masumi, there's this sort of infinite reservoir of what he calls, following Deleuze, the virtual, this sort of radical potentiality, which itself is unlivable, but which becomes actualized through bodily experiences that disrupt the real of our looping consciousness. So the notion comes by way of Deleuze from Spinoza. Here, bodily or affective experience becomes a sort of pathway to new thoughts, new insights, and new inspiration, likely in a way that's similar to those cited by religious traditions. And indeed, contemporary psychedelic culture also offers some way of sort of describing this experience of sort of transcending your own self and your own ego. And I think Masumi's writing on this can be really useful for those who are interested in Mark Fisher's idea of sort of acid communism, which is this sort of almost bodily way of escaping what he calls capitalist realism. So in summary, affect theory, and this is where I'm closing up, and hopefully we can open a discussion. Affect theory offers a new way to think about politics. It theorizes forms of influence and control that are extremely insidious and difficult to spot, or even to separate from our own emotional understandings of ourselves and our identities. In this sense, affect theory is part of a sort of post-structuralist school of thought, even if it takes issue with some of the other aspects of that aspect of critical theory. It offers new ways to engage with science, as well as sort of new approaches to spiritual questions. And importantly, affect theory opens up new possibilities for resistance and contingency in the face of late capitalism, patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, and the other types of structuring power formations that we live in. As Masumi explains in his text, is the very idea of affects that allows for a new form of agency rooted in conscious reflection. And therefore, I think we should all care about affect theory and take the time to really gain literacy in it. Anyway, those were the sort of things I wanted to say, just to orient us in the sort of discourse of affect. I probably won't again do that every time, but I just did want to do that this time, just to get us all on the same page. So with that out of the way, I wonder if maybe we could have a general discussion of affect in the text that we read this week. And I do have a few discussion questions I'll just throw out there, and I may reassert them later if we run out of steam on anything. But those questions were, maybe we want to discuss this sort of gap between meaning and affect, or content and effect, as Masumi puts it. There's this distinction between emotion and affect, which would definitely be worth talking about. There's the status of biological and cognitive science in affect theory that I think would be really interesting to talk about, especially since we have people in the sciences here. And related to that, how sort of culture meets biology in affect theory, and Masumi had a lot of comments on that in his piece. We could also discuss how affect theory is not merely a descriptive theory, but also offers these sort of tools for intervention, and what those are and what those look like. There's this sort of paradox that Masumi points to. He calls it a productive paradox of theorizing and producing discursive meaning about affect theory, which is trying to transcend discursive meaning. And then finally, this question of spirituality and whether materialism, the version of materialism offered by affect theory, can account for what spiritual traditions are tapping into. So yeah, those are the sort of discussion points I figured I'd raise. But maybe we can use the hands. I think that's usually a useful way to discuss stuff. Yeah, does anyone have anything they want to say? Sorry for going on so long.